The security footage showed a thin boy slipping a worn book under his jacket. Not his first time. The staff had started to notice titles disappearing, always non-fiction, always advanced, physics, history, algebra. The boy never caused trouble. He just came in quietly, always alone, always watching, until the day someone grabbed his shoulder and called him out. He froze. No excuses, no struggle, only wide eyes and a soft whisper. "I just wanted to learn." But what came next, no one expected, because the librarian didn't scold him. She pulled him close and hugged him like he was carrying the weight of 100 closed doors. And for the first time, someone handed him a book and said, "You don't have to steal knowledge. You belong here." What she did next would not only change his life, but ignite a movement in the town that no one saw coming. Under the flickering lights of the aging city library, the boy moved like a shadow, quiet, purposeful, and largely unnoticed. His name was Malik, though no one there yet knew it. He slipped in just after the doors opened most evenings, his hoodie pulled low and his footsteps soundless against the carpeted floor. To many, he was invisible, but to those who watched closely, his presence was like clockwork, always alone, always late in the day, always making his way to the back rows where the non-fiction shelves leaned under the weight of knowledge most patrons ignored. He wasn't there for fiction, for escape. He didn't touch fantasy or the bright-covered new arrivals. Instead, he sought out the heavy spines, the ones cracked from years of being handled by serious hands. Books on mechanical engineering, advanced algebra, world history volumes with thin, worn pages. Sometimes he would spend an hour just staring at a diagram, eyes narrowed, lips slightly parted as if memorizing it by sheer force of will. His clothes were clean but tired, his backpack frayed at the seams. He never carried a phone, never asked for help, and never checked anything out. The librarians began to take note, not out of concern at first, but out of confusion. He didn't appear on the registry. No card, no account, yet he visited more than most. He sat with the same books repeatedly, sometimes taking notes in a dog-eared spiral notebook with the cover half torn off. His pen would scratch steadily as he flipped pages with reverence. Sometimes he would glance at the clock, then at the exit, as if measuring how much time remained before the library closed its doors and he would have to return to whatever waited outside. Some evenings, the staff would find books slightly out of place, volumes not returned to the same shelf, or facing the wrong way. Once, a particularly observant assistant noticed one of the more expensive science texts was gone. The next week, another book disappeared, but there were no signs of damage or forced access, just absence, titles that no child his age had much reason to steal. They held a meeting, security footage was reviewed, and there he was, Malik, in grainy black and white, slipping a thick hardcover under his hoodie before ducking out the door. It wasn't hurried, not panicked, but careful. Practiced, not the first time. He always waited until the checkout desk was distracted, always chose his moment like someone studying patterns. No one confronted him at first. The assumption was that he was doing harm. After all, theft is theft. And yet something in the way he moved, the way he studied, unsettled their judgment. He wasn't loitering. He wasn't there to meet friends. He wasn't avoiding the world. He was absorbing it in printed form, page by page. Outside the library, the world Malik lived in was harder. His mother worked double shifts. His father hadn't been around in years. His school lacked updated materials, and his teachers, though kind, were overworked. He had no computer at home, no internet. But he had ambition, and a sharp, restless mind that wouldn't stay quiet. The library was his only sanctuary, a place where no one yelled, where ideas were stored on shelves he could reach, even if he couldn't technically borrow them. So he read, every night. He learned to move between topics, from calculus to political theory. He understood that his reach was limited, but he didn't accept that his future had to be. He memorized parts of texts, transcribed entire paragraphs by hand. He read case studies on design architecture, studied maps of constellations. He kept a growing chart of every element on the periodic table. In his world, information wasn't free. It had to be taken, folded into memory or captured on scrap paper before time ran out. Still, he never caused a stir. He was polite in his silence, never spoke unless spoken to, and even then, his voice barely carried. For most, he remained a blur on the edges of the library's nightly routine. But for the head librarian, Mrs. Halberd, something about him stuck. She'd seen that posture before, on students who had nowhere else to go, on children who felt the weight of their own minds in places that didn't know what to do with them. She began to watch from behind the stacks. She noticed how his eyes darted across equations like they were sentences in a comic book, how his shoulders only relaxed once he was seated at his corner table, how he handled each book like it was on loan from the gods, not just stolen, but sacred. And when the tally of missing books grew, her heart didn't race with frustration. It broke, because what she saw wasn't a thief. It was a student, one the system had forgotten and who had no other means left to reach knowledge but to steal it quietly in the dark. But she didn't act. Not yet. She needed to be sure. She needed to know the story behind the hoodie and the silence and the books that vanished like breath in cold air. And that meant waiting, watching, and being ready for the moment he would finally be caught. Not to punish him, but to understand why a boy like that felt he had no other choice. And that moment was coming, faster than anyone knew. Under the dim lights of the library, Malik's hands moved with familiar precision. His fingers traced the spines of books like keys on a piano, his eyes scanning the faded gold titles until he found what he needed. The book was thick, dense, and unfamiliar to most, a college-level guide to applied physics, its pages heavy with formulas and diagrams. He glanced around, quietly assessing the room. The usual evening crowd had thinned. One librarian was stacking returned books at the counter, another flipping through paperwork in the office behind a glass panel. The timing felt right. He pulled the book from the shelf and slipped it under his jacket. It was a motion he'd repeated before, smooth, practiced, and, until now, unnoticed. But this evening was different. A new volunteer, younger and more alert, had been tasked with shelving in the same aisle Malik frequented. She watched him out of the corner of her eye, curious about the boy who always read but never borrowed. Something about his movements seemed odd, not threatening, but deliberate. She stepped forward just as he turned to leave, and when she called out, her voice startled more than just Malik. He froze. The book under his jacket felt like a stone pressing against his ribs. The silence that followed was instant and suffocating. The sound of pages turning and keyboards clacking came to a halt. One of the librarians rose from her desk. The volunteer approached slowly, not with anger but uncertainty. Malik didn't run. He didn't protest. He just stood there, chest rising and falling, eyes locked on the carpet. His shoulders dropped, not in shame, but in exhaustion. When asked to open his jacket, he did. The book slipped out and landed on the floor with a thud that echoed far louder than it should have. A thick, expensive text, stamped with the library's barcode and a bright red sticker reading, "Reference only." Not for checkout, not for home. Malik reached down to pick it up, his hands steady even as his breathing wasn't. Mrs. Halberd had seen enough from her office window. She stepped out just as others began to gather. A few patrons whispered. One mother tugged her child away, casting Malik a glance full of assumptions, but Mrs. Halberd didn't look at the book or the jacket. She looked at Malik, and in his face, she saw what she'd suspected for weeks. Not defiance, not arrogance, but hunger. The quiet, aching kind that has nothing to do with food and everything to do with being left behind. Someone suggested calling the police. Another murmured about banning him from the building. But the head librarian raised her hand gently and asked everyone to return to their reading. They hesitated, murmured, then slowly obeyed. The atmosphere didn't settle. It only paused. She led Malik to her desk, not by force, but with a quiet gesture. He followed, wordless, like someone accepting the inevitable. He sat down slowly, still holding the book, still waiting for the punishment he assumed was next. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He simply waited, because that's what the world had taught him to do. When you get caught, you wait for the weight to fall. But it didn't. Mrs. Halberd didn't ask him why he stole the book. She asked what he saw in it. At first he said nothing, but then slowly he explained how his school had no current science textbooks, how he wanted to understand propulsion, not just in theory, but in real application. How he saw diagrams in this book that matched pieces of thoughts he'd had but couldn't name. How the internet cafe by his apartment charged more than he could afford. How sometimes he'd copy pages by hand until his fingers cramped, and how even then he felt like he was still too slow, like he was racing against a clock no one else could hear. He spoke not with rehearsed guilt, but with careful honesty. Like someone who had never had the chance to say these things out loud before, like someone who was terrified of what saying them might cost. And Mrs. Halberd in that moment didn't see a thief. She saw a boy denied tools, denied access, denied permission to be curious in a world that only made space for certain kinds of questions asked by certain kinds of people. He wasn't stealing for rebellion. He was stealing for a chance, for knowledge, for self-worth. She didn't scold him. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she stepped closer. And in a move that stunned not only Malik, but every quiet observer in the building, she wrapped her arms around him in a firm, warm hug. It wasn't pity. It was recognition, an acknowledgement that the world had failed this boy long before he ever slipped that book under his coat. The moment lingered, awkward in its tenderness. Malik didn't hug back at first, but after a second he did. Gently, slowly, like someone trying to believe it was real. The book, still in his lap, pressed between them like a fragile bridge built on paper and understanding. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, something shifted. And for Malik, the fear of being caught was slowly replaced with something unfamiliar and terrifying in its own way: hope. The next morning, the library felt different. It was the same building, the same dusty sunbeams pushing through tall windows, the same low hum of pages turning and fingers tapping at keyboards, but something intangible had shifted. In the quiet corners where the air usually hung thick with silence, there was now something softer, something warmer, like the hush that settles over a crowd before a performance. Malik didn't return that day, nor the day after. His absence stretched like a thread across the hours, invisible but unmistakable. The chair he always occupied in the far back of the nonfiction section sat empty, his favorite books untouched, the small scuff his shoe had worn into the carpet remaining like a footprint no one had bothered to clean. And yet, even without him there, his presence lingered like a whispered question left unanswered. Mrs. Halberd thought of him constantly. His voice, low but certain, when he spoke about what he wanted to learn, and the way he had held that book the night he was caught, not like a possession, but like a responsibility. She knew she had to do something, not out of guilt, but out of understanding. Malik had shown her a mirror, one that reflected not just his struggle, but the quiet complicity of institutions that claimed to serve knowledge while locking it behind walls of formality and rules that assumed equal footing where none existed. She began with the basics. She dug into old donations, pulling out books that had been set aside for discard, not because they were useless, but because they were considered outdated or unpopular. She remembered which volumes Malik had studied most and made a list. With the help of a sympathetic staff member, she tracked down a few newer editions, ones she'd been meaning to process but hadn't had the time. Then, she did something the system didn't normally allow. She began curating a private collection, not for the public, not for the shelves, but for a boy who needed them more than anyone else. In a quiet corner of the library basement where unused furniture gathered dust, she cleared space on a small table and arranged a stack of books in a neat row. Physics, chemistry, architecture, engineering, biology, all the volumes Malik had pored over, plus others she thought he might grow into. She placed a soft reading lamp beside them and a worn but sturdy chair. Above it, she pinned a small note written in her own hand. Reserved, for the one who learns without permission. But it wasn't enough to simply offer a seat. She wanted to give him more, something lasting, something he could carry with him. So she reached out to an old friend, a retired teacher who volunteered with a local youth foundation. Together, they arranged for Malik to receive a refurbished laptop. Nothing fancy, but loaded with offline science resources, free educational software, and a browser pre-saved with links to public access journals and math solvers. The final step was the library card. Not just a temporary one, but a permanent card in his name, pre-approved for extended borrowing and flagged under a special internal note that exempted it from overdue penalties. She placed all of it, books, laptop, library card, inside a sturdy canvas tote, the kind they normally sold for a few dollars at the checkout desk. But this one she filled not with merchandise, but with possibility. It was wrapped with a blue ribbon that had once adorned a holiday display and hadn't seen light since. Then she waited. On the third evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline and threw long shadows across the library floor, the bell above the door chimed. Malik entered, slow and hesitant. His hoodie was the same, his steps careful, but there was something new in his eyes, something watchful. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of fragile uncertainty, like a question waiting to be answered. Mrs. Halberd met him halfway, her expression calm, no reprimand in sight. She didn't say much, just pointed gently toward the basement stairwell, the one normally closed to public use but now left ajar. Malik followed her silently, descending the narrow steps with cautious steps. When he turned the corner and saw the small reading nook lit with the glow of a soft lamp, his body stopped, his breath caught in his chest. The books were there, arranged with care, the chair, the table, the note on the wall, and beside it all, the tote, its fabric heavy with weight, but also something more, something sacred. He approached slowly, afraid to touch it at first. Then he reached out, lifted the ribbon, and opened the bag. Inside, he found the laptop, the folders of printed diagrams and workbooks, the library card tucked into a handwritten envelope that simply read, "To Malik, because knowledge belongs to you too." He stood there, silent, unmoving, the bag in his hands and 1,000 unspoken thoughts rising to his eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he sat, not rushed, not afraid. He opened a book, adjusted the lamp, and began to read, just as he always had. But this time, he didn't have to hide. Mrs. Halberd remained on the stairs for a while, just watching. She didn't intrude. She didn't ask for thanks. She knew what she'd given him wasn't charity. It was acknowledgement. Recognition of effort in a world that often demanded perfection before permission. And she knew that what mattered most wasn't the books, or the laptop, or even the space. It was that someone had seen him, not as a thief, but as a student, as a thinker, as someone who deserved a chance to reach the stars written in the pages he so desperately wanted to hold. The town of Elmsworth was not large. It was the kind of place where people recognized faces even if they didn't know names, and news traveled faster than the wind that rustled through its maple-lined streets. In a community where familiarity reigned, small stories often grew large overnight, and this one began with whispers in the library and spread like ripples across still water. The narrative, incomplete and misshapen in its early forms, took many shapes depending on who told it. A boy had been caught stealing. A librarian had let him off. A library had been turned into a shelter for pity. Each retelling was shaded with bias, some tinged with judgment, others with confusion, and a few with quiet awe. The truth, as it often is, settled somewhere between all those versions, waiting for the town to catch up. At first, only the staff and regulars of the library noticed the change. The back room, once a forgotten corner of forgotten books, had been transformed. There was a new lamp that glowed into the hallway late into the evening. Occasionally, someone would see Malik through the glass window, seated with his eyes locked onto a page, or typing slowly on a modest gray laptop. He came often now, arriving just as school let out, and sometimes staying until the closing bell rang. He didn't linger near the main desk. He didn't talk unless spoken to. But those who did speak to him found something unexpected, an articulation of thought far beyond his years, a hunger to learn that dwarfed any punishment one might have imagined for the theft that started it all. The volunteer who had first spotted Malik that night shared the story with a friend, who shared it with another. Soon, murmurs began to echo in the hallways of the local high school. Some students mocked it. "The book thief got a reward?" they scoffed. But others, especially those who had grown up under the same weight of financial uncertainty, found in Malik a quiet symbol of something they couldn't name but deeply felt. He had done what many only dreamed of, reaching beyond what was permitted, not to rebel, but to survive with dignity. Parents overheard their children talking about the library's basement classroom. A few even came in to ask if it was real. Mrs. Halberd never confirmed nor denied the details. She simply said the library was a place where all people deserved access to knowledge. Some raised eyebrows. One parent even wrote a letter to the town board questioning whether it was safe to allow unsupervised behavior from troubled youth on library property. But the board, made up of neighbors who had known Mrs. Halberd for decades, chose not to act on the complaint. Perhaps they understood more than they let on, or perhaps they too had grown weary of the old definitions of discipline. Meanwhile, something else was shifting. A local journalist who frequented the library for research heard about Malik's story and pitched it quietly to the town's paper. The editors hesitated at first. Stories about children and mistakes were delicate things, but the reporter approached it with care, interviewing only those who offered, writing from a place of observation rather than judgment. The article appeared on a quiet Sunday, buried in the middle pages. It carried a simple headline, "A Borrowed Chance, One Teen's Journey Through the Library's Quietest Aisle." It did not name Malik directly. It did not glorify or demonize. It simply told the story as it was, about a boy who wanted to learn, who took what he couldn't reach, and who found in an unexpected place a door that had never before been opened to him. That article changed everything. The next day, 3 people came to the library to donate books. 2 of them asked whether the collection in the back needed science materials or notebooks. One dropped off a used tablet, anonymously. A week later, a retired professor from the nearby college emailed the library offering to tutor students who lacked access to academic support. Malik never asked for any of it. He barely spoke when new faces came around, but he noticed. And more importantly, he understood. The stares he received in public changed in tone. Some people looked away now, uncomfortable with their own assumptions. Others looked with something resembling respect. The local pastor mentioned his story in a sermon on grace. A barista at the coffee shop once slipped him an extra sandwich without saying a word. One morning, when he passed a group of older teens outside the gas station, they didn't taunt him like they used to. Instead, one of them nodded. It was a small gesture, a flick of the chin, but it carried weight, recognition. Still, not all reactions were warm. There were whispers in church pews and bitter laughs at town hall about rewarding theft. One older woman in the grocery store muttered something under her breath as Malik walked by. But those voices began to matter less, because the louder voices, the ones that called for understanding and for the breaking of quiet cycles of denial, were growing bolder. What the town saw over time wasn't just a boy who had taken a book. It was the mirror he held up to a system. And in that reflection, many saw themselves, not as perpetrators, but as people who had stood by for too long while access was hoarded behind gates labeled policy. What they saw was possibility, the possibility that one act of compassion could lead to another, that the walls they believed were immovable could, in fact, be doors. And in the heart of that shift, in the quiet between turning pages and glowing lamplight, sat Malik, reading, learning, becoming. Not a symbol, not a headline, but a boy who had dared to reach until someone reached back. Malik had never asked for his name to be placed on anything. He had never expected attention or recognition. All he had ever wanted was access, a key to the locked doors that seemed to surround every piece of knowledge he sought. Yet as the weeks passed, the library began to change in ways he could not have predicted, and those changes bore his name in quiet, steady tribute. It started with a single shelf, one that stood in the back corner of the main reading room, close enough to the window to catch the afternoon light, but far enough from the bustle that it remained a place of peace. The shelf was old, reclaimed from storage, its wood darkened by time and use, but sturdy in a way that spoke of resilience. It was cleaned, polished, and set apart from the others, and at the top, in simple block letters burned into a brass plate, were the words, Malik's Shelf. At first, Malik didn't notice it. He came as he always did, head down, backpack light, eyes focused on the familiar path to the study nook that had become his sanctuary. But that day, something about the light caught his attention. He turned, and there it was. A shelf filled not with random donations or forgotten volumes, but with books carefully chosen. Titles on physics, engineering, history, coding, architecture, and environmental science. There were beginner texts and advanced treatises, workbooks with blank margins begging for notes, and journals filled with diagrams. Mixed among them were tools, a box of drawing pencils, a protractor, a calculator still in its plastic wrap. Mrs. Halberd had curated it quietly, drawing from donations, grants, and personal contributions. But it hadn't been just her. The community, moved by Malik's story, had come forward with gifts. A retired engineer donated manuals. A college student passed along old textbooks. A local business funded a subscription to an online learning platform, printed and bound for offline use. The shelf grew slowly, deliberately, each edition a testament to the boy who had once felt he had to steal knowledge just to hold it. Malik approached the shelf as though it might disappear if he moved too quickly. His fingers brushed the spines of the books, feeling the textures, the raised lettering, the smooth gloss of new covers, and the soft wear of used ones. He read the plate with his name and felt a strange pull in his chest. Not pride, exactly, but something deeper, something like belonging. This wasn't a prize, it wasn't charity. It was a promise in wood and paper. From that day on, the shelf became more than a collection of books. It became a point of connection. Younger students who had heard of Malik's story came to browse it, seeking titles he recommended, hoping perhaps some of what fueled him might spark in them as well. Malik never claimed ownership of the space, but he protected it in his own quiet way, reshelving books with care, cleaning dust from the corners, straightening pencils and paper stacks. Over time, he began to leave notes tucked into the pages of certain books, encouragements, clarifications, problem solutions, even challenges for the next reader. The shelf became interactive, a conversation between minds across time and pages. Teachers began referring struggling students to it. Parents stopped by, curious about the boy who had inspired such generosity. The library applied for a grant to expand the idea, a set of shelves in every branch dedicated to community-curated learning resources. They called it the Malik model. Malik remained humble through it all. He still came to the library not for attention but for study. He filled notebook after notebook, always with his same steady hand, always seated by the window where the light fell across the words and figures he copied with devotion. But sometimes when he paused to stretch his fingers or rub the back of his neck, he would glance over at the shelf that bore his name, and a small, quiet smile would cross his face, because he knew that long after he moved on, long after his own hands were no longer the ones turning those pages, Malik's shelf would remain. A reminder that a single act of reaching, whether for a book or for a boy, could build something lasting. Something no lock could bar, no rule could forbid. Something that said in the clearest language of all, "You are welcome here." There were moments in Malik's life that settled like stones in the corners of his memory. Moments he would return to over and over, not out of regret, but reflection. The night he first slipped a book into his bag without checking it out was one of them. He remembered the sharp flicker of fear in his chest, the weight of the pages pressed against his side, the cold air outside that bit harder than usual. And most of all, he remembered the silence, the heavy, echoing quiet of a decision made in desperation. It wasn't pride or rebellion that guided his hand that night. It was hunger, not for food, but for something more enduring, something harder to explain. A hunger to know, to grow, to feel equal to the world that so often made him feel invisible. He never stole again, not because he had been caught, not because he had been forgiven, but because someone had seen past the act and into the need that drove it. Because a librarian with steady eyes and a soft voice had chosen compassion over punishment. That choice had rippled out in ways no one had predicted, and in time, it began to shape the way others made their choices too. In the months that followed the article and the shelf, the town's conversation changed. Schools began looking at how they handled students who lacked resources. A quiet partnership grew between the public library and the local school district. Students with overdue books were no longer barred from checking out new ones. A policy change, small on paper, but monumental in practice. Teachers started carrying spare pens, spare snacks, quiet understanding. They no longer waited for a crisis to extend help. They noticed the signs, the silences, the shifts in posture and energy, because Malik had shown them what could hide behind lowered eyes. Mrs. Halberd became a speaker at regional librarian conferences. She never used Malik's full name, only called him a reader who reminded me why libraries matter. She spoke not about rules, but about values. Not about theft, but access. The rooms always grew quiet when she described how that one act of taking had given her the chance to give back something far greater than punishment could have achieved. She'd finish every talk with the same sentence. When we punish hunger, we don't stop the theft. We starve the potential. Malik, for his part, stayed the same in many ways. He remained quiet in class, still walked home with his head slightly down, and still spent more time in the library than anywhere else. But inside, a shift had taken root. Where there had once been only survival, now there was direction. His grades rose. He spoke more in science class. When a younger boy was mocked for mispronouncing a word during reading time, Malik was the one who leaned over and whispered the correct way, then smiled and gave a thumbs up. He didn't forget where he had started. That night with the book was still there, but now it was joined by others, better ones. The day he found his name on a shelf. The moment a stranger donated their old tablet, for that library kid who reads like the world depends on it. The quiet nods from people who used to cross the street to avoid him. Even the way his mother looked at him now, not with worry, but with hope. And eventually, Malik began to speak. Not loud, not often, but enough. When a visiting librarian asked him what he would change if he could, he said one sentence that made her tear up behind her glasses. I'd make it so no one ever has to steal a book again. Never again. Not because libraries are now perfect or because poverty has been erased, but because the story had shifted. Because a boy had taken something that wasn't his, and in doing so, reminded a whole town of what truly belonged to everyone. Knowledge, access, a place to belong, and maybe, just maybe, a shelf with your name on it waiting to be filled.